Okay, and once the computer tells me I can start, I can start. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for coming, especially when the weather was so horrible earlier this afternoon. Now, we're sort of continuing from where we left off last week when we talked about the Tisha B'Av, the day commemorated on the 9th day of Av. This year that is, well, it's technically a Saturday, but since Shabbat is a joyous day, that means we wait until Saturday night, Sunday to commemorate the destruction, because even though Tisha B'Av is such an important day in the year, Shabbat is more important. So Tisha B'Av this year is Saturday night, Sunday morning. But in the process of talking about that, we need to talk a little bit more about why the temples were destroyed, but also what is our obligation for talking to people with whom we disagree, or more importantly, who we see that are doing something wrong. Now, I already had this scheduled before the events unfolded over the last weekend with the horrible murders in our country, but in some ways that only makes it more relevant. So we'll see what we got. The first text that we have may sound a little familiar. This is just a reminder of one that we discussed last week when we talked about the Tisha B'Av and the temple's destruction. Why was the first temple destroyed? The sages ask. Because of three evils in it: idolatry, immorality, and bloodshed. People worship idols, people were having incest and adultery, and people were murdering each other. Those are, in Jewish law, generally considered to be the big three. As a little aside, although we don't normally rank different commandments, there does come certain points in life where you do have to make choices. Unfortunately, in our history, there were times when people would say, break this commandment or I will kill you. And in general, the rule is you are allowed to break the commandment to save your life, unless it's one of these three. So if someone says, I want you to murder this person, or else I'll kill you, it's better to die than to murder another innocent person. If someone says, I want you to sleep with your mother, it's better to die than to commit incest. And if someone says, I need you to publicly bow down and worship this idol to show that you reject God, then it would be better to go ahead and say, nope. But if they say, I want you to eat some ham, I want you to light a fire on Shabbat, I want you to stop praying, if it's to save your life, then you can certainly do that to save your life. So these big three were the three that are considered to be ones that you absolutely under no circumstances should be doing, and yet they were very common in the time of the first temple. All you have to do is read the book of Kings and read the books of all the prophets to see just how bad these were. But why was the second temple destroyed? It seemed that during the time that it stood, people occupied themselves with Torah. This is when we had all the famous rabbis and all of the beginning of really the synagogue culture and life of study. And with the observance of mitzvot, this is where people began to practice the commandments much more often and much more passionately. And they weren't content to just say, the temple is doing it. People did it in their own lives more and more. And we had the practice of tzedakah. People were pretty good about helping each other when there was a need, of giving what we would call charity in English, not quite the right word, but giving support to other people in need. So people were doing good stuff. So why was the temple destroyed? Right? They weren't murdering, they weren't doing immorality, they weren't idol worshiping, and they were doing good things. What happened? Well, because during the time that it stood, the second temple, baseless hatred, sinat chinam, prevailed. That this was a common feature within the community. And this is to teach you that sinat chinam, this baseless hatred, is deemed as grave as all the three sins of idolatry, immorality, and bloodshed together. That is a heavy level of rhetoric, right? That is a strong condemnation to say that hatred is really right up there as one of the worst things that a person can do, not only to themselves, but to the community around them. And that hatred is not just an emotion, but hatred is a destructive force. And so that needs to be in our mind as we talk about how do you rebuke someone? How do you criticize someone? Because if you fall into hatred while doing criticism, then you're not doing it right. So we're going to look at that in more detail. So first of all, why do I need to tell someone they're doing something wrong? Why do I have to do rebuke? Or as, it's a typo, or as we say in Hebrew, tochecha, That should be an O after the T, not an E. Tochacha, which I think is just as useful as the word rebuke, because most people don't know the English word rebuke. It's just not a common word. Is there someone else coming? Thank you. So where do we know that we need to do this rebuke, that we need to point out when someone is making a mistake? Well, in the book of Leviticus, you shall not hate your kinsfolk in your heart, reprove your kinsmen, but incur no guilt because of them. All right, two very simple sentences that fit together for this verse, which have a lot of complicated implications. Right, so you shall not hate your kinsfolk. Right? Don't hate someone else in your heart, and reprove them. That's another word for rebuke or criticize. Point out their errors, your kinsmen, but incur no guilt because of them. So we're going to have to figure out, how do I criticize someone but not hate them, but in the way that I criticize them also don't cause any additional guilt, don't cause any new problems. That is the needle that we have to thread. Make sense? All right, tiny verse, big issue. So first of all, we can see that it's important to step up. We get an example of somebody who did this. It's called Moses. Moses's first act was the act of stepping up. So from Darchei Moshe, this is one of the great commentators, he said, "The four actions of Moses, our leader, inform us of his greatness of spirit, full of divine courage, distinguished, who could not bear to see persecution and oppression, and who did all he could to save and redeem others. When he was in the royal palace, for example, Moses went out to see with his own eyes the situations of his brothers of the house of Israel. And his beating the Egyptian who beat one of our fellow Hebrews, and his rebuke to the evil Hebrew who beat his fellow man, and his saving the 7 daughters of the Midianite priest Jethro, from the hand of shepherds and robbers." So if you think about the first few times we see Moses acting, right? Not when he's just a little baby in the water, but when he's a man and living his life and doing things. The first 4 things that are his main markers of his life are all acts of defense against people that are being oppressed, and acts of rebuke to other people that are doing something wrong. That is an amazing beginning for a person. This is somebody who is not willing to just sit there. This is someone who wants to step up when they see a problem. Goes out to see the slaves. He confronts the person beating the slave and unfortunately kills him. It wasn't his plan. He then confronts the person who criticized him for trying to stop another argument, and he tried to stop the argument in the first place. And then when he goes off into a completely new place, he comes across a random situation where he sees these women who are being harassed by these robbers and other shepherds, and he steps in to help them too. That is his character. As he goes on to say, "And from this must every person of wide heart and Holy Spirit learn to take a stand and save their brothers and sisters from the hand of those who exploit them, especially in those places where our brothers and sisters are oppressed and tormented by those of no covenant." Meaning, you have to save them even if it's Jewish people doing the wrong thing, and you definitely have to save them when it's not Jewish people doing the bad stuff to them. Right? It doesn't really matter. We need to save people who are being oppressed. Make sense? All right, so example number 1, Moses. But Rambam, Moses ben Maimon, in about the year 1100, wrote in his Mishnah Torah a little bit more information about what is the law of a good temperament. What is a good character like? And he has a lot of things to say, but on this topic, he says this: "If one sees that someone sinned or walks in a way that is not good, it is their duty to bring them back to the right path and point out that he or she is wronging him or herself by this evil course. As it is said, you shall surely rebuke your neighbor." Our verse originally from Leviticus 19. So that's the simple version. Now, that simple version, you probably have met people, sometimes makes people do poor jobs of this. You're doing that wrong. Maybe not the best way to get the point across, as Rambam goes on to talk about. One who rebukes another, whether for offenses against the one who rebukes him or herself, or for sins against God, should administer the rebuke in private, speak to the offender gently and tenderly, and point out that the rebuke is offered for the wrongdoer's own good, to secure for the other life in the world to come. That is the template. So you see someone insults you, for example, one of the most common forms of misbehavior in our current world, right? There's not a whole lot of people walking up and punching you on the street, but people will often do things that are rude or insulting. So let's take a quick example. You're standing in line at the supermarket, and the person bashes into you with their shopping cart, right? Happens way too often. You have the option to rebuke them by turning around going, "Watch where you're going, you idiot." Doesn't work, right? Or you could sort of lean over privately and say, "I just wanted to let you know, but you hit me with your cart, and I'm sure that isn't what you intended to do, because we all know that that would not be a good thing for us," right? You're not trying to humiliate them. You're not trying to embarrass them in public. You're not trying to make them feel that you're attacking them. You want them to feel like you are offering them constructive criticism. Now, that can still cause problems as we're going to unpack it going on. So we're not done. That's why we have another 45 minutes of this. So as Rambam goes on to say, if the person accepts the rebuke, well and good, right? Success, they listen to you. If not, the person should rebuke.
The Rambam in Maimonides?
That's Maimonides, yes, exactly. Rambam is the usual Hebrew name for Moshe ben Maimon. It's his acronym. That's why a lot of the famous rabbis, you'll see all their names begin with with an R, because it's Rabbi Moshe ben Maimon, Rambam.
Okay.
Right? It's an acronym made out of his name. Or Rabbi Shlomo ben Yitzchak, Rashi. Right? It's many of the most famous rabbis all have names that are made out of an acronym of their full name, because as you probably noticed, full Jewish names get a little long. So Rambam is his Hebrew name, but if you are reading him in a Western philosophy class, because Rambam was a great philosopher as well, and who was read by people who weren't even Jewish, most importantly Aquinas, then in the English-speaking world, he is called Maimonides, because they put an "ides" at the end of everyone who came from the Middle East when it came into the Latin world. So it became Maimonides. That's just the way they did it. Nachman, which was another great rabbi of the Middle Ages, Nachmanides. That's just how Latin worked. Okay, so if he accepts, great. If not, do a second or a third time. And so one is bound to continue the admonitions until the sinner assaults the admonisher and says, "I refuse to listen." Right? You can't give up on other people. That is one of the lessons of our verse from Leviticus 19, which is, if you hated the person, you wouldn't bother to help them by pointing out the mistake. Right? Criticizing a person shouldn't be a sign of hate, because if you really hated them, you just would let them continue to do wrong so that they would destroy themselves. Taking the effort and the risk of pointing out the mistake, that is a sign of caring and compassion and love, if you do it the right way, right? If you do it in a way that isn't humiliating and destructive. And that's what Rambam is trying to tell us here. If the person eventually is willing to say, "Stop it," okay, at that point, they have made their choice, at least for the moment, and you can back off. We're good? Okay. Whoever is in a position to prevent wrongdoing and does not do so is responsible for the iniquity of all the wrongdoers whom that person might have restrained. Right, think about that sentence, and I'll recast it again in more modern English. If you have the power to try and protest or prevent something bad from happening, and you choose to not do anything, you choose to stay silent, to not act, you are as guilty as the person who did it. Now, we don't all have that power, right? We're not always in a position to stop every wrongdoing in the world. I'm sure that there were murders in India yesterday that I have no way to try and stop. But if I were to see a crime about to happen here in front of me, and I didn't call 911, then I should feel as guilty as the criminal who did the crime. Now, I wouldn't be punished exactly the same way. It's not like I'd be going to jail for car theft if I watched someone steal a car and didn't try and stop it. But in my own spirit, I would be as guilty as the person who put the key in and took off. That is a very high bar to set for ourselves and for our society. but it's also very much the philosophy of Judaism, that Judaism is not a purely individualistic faith. Right? We are part of a group, and our group is part of the group of humanity, and we're responsible to each other. We're responsible for each other. I can't just make my own little corner of the world beautiful and perfect and good, like a tiny little garden, and everything outside of there can be dark and evil, but my garden is, no, says Judaism. That's not why God created us. That's not why we are created as a community. Is there someone else?
I guess it's Jared.
What? Yeah. All right, he's running very late. All right, so let's move on. Give him a couple. Is he already moving to the door? Yeah, sometimes he takes a while to get out of the car. Okay, so let's get to the nitty gritty of how the second temple was destroyed. This is during the time of the Romans, and this is during the time when the sages, the Chachamim, the rabbis, were very active in the world around them. So, Bar Kamsa. All right. Bar Kamsa is the name of our villain, but he's also the name of our victim. Bar Kamsa was once treated with exceptionally humiliating rudeness by another man at a party. There's a whole backstory to this, but we don't have time. But basically, he got invited to the party by mistake, and when he showed up, the host absolutely humiliated him in front of everyone. So, Bar Kamsa, he's mad. He is fuming. And so he thought to himself, since the sages, the Chachamim, the rabbis who were there, were sitting there and did not stop it, I will go and inform against them to the Romans. So notice, Bar Kamsa, being a good Jewish person, realizes that everybody's responsible for everyone, and if you do nothing when you could have prevented it, then you're guilty. He doesn't want revenge on the host who humiliated him. He wants revenge on the sages who talk about doing good and talk about all that stuff, but sat there and let him be humiliated without trying to stop it. Now, he's not saying that maybe they couldn't have stopped it. Maybe if they'd gotten up and tried to talk to the host, maybe the host would have thrown them out too. We don't know. But the fact is they sat silent, and therefore he is going to get even with them. Now, this is also where we can see that if you have the power to protest and you choose not to protest, it can come back not only to bite you, it can come back to bite the entire nation. Because this little argument over a party is going to lead to the destruction of the second temple. So what happened? So he goes and he tells the Roman, the people are rebelling against you. The empire doesn't believe it at first and say, prove it, that there's actually a rebellion going on. So since he had claimed they didn't offer up the sacrifices sent on behalf of the Romans, the Roman government would pay for cows to be sacrificed in Jerusalem. Yeah, I know the Romans were a little weird. They basically allowed everyone to do sacrifices for them. And he said, the Jews, they take those cows and they don't use them. Right? They're throwing them away. They're not using them for the sacrifice, which of course would be a huge, rude offense and a sign of pushing back against Rome. And Rome doesn't like any of that. So he told them to put that to the test. So they sent with him a fine cow, perfectly fine cow. And on the way to the temple, Bar Kamsa takes and he makes a blemish on its upper lip, right? He digs his fingernail or something up inside the lip. And that is a place that's considered a problem for Jewish law, but wasn't considered a problem for Roman law, right? Everybody agrees that you don't sacrifice a bad cow. But what's the definition of a blemish, of a bad cow? We have a slightly different standard than the Romans did. So he made a mark that would ruin the cow for us, but which the Romans would consider no problem. You see how he's setting the trap? Okay. So the cow comes to the temple, and the sages look at it, and they recognize what's up. They see the situation. They say, the cow is not really fit to be offered as a sacrifice, but if we don't offer it as a sacrifice, the Romans are going to attack. There's going to be war. And so the sages said, okay, we should offer it, right? For the sake of saving the nation from war, we will offer something that shouldn't be on the altar. It's a wonderful reminder of the flexibility of the ancient world. Unfortunately, it is cut short because Rabbi Zechariah ben Avkulus says, but people will say that blemished animals are offered on the altar. You can't do that. You can't you can't sacrifice this animal, because then everyone will say it's okay to bring blemished animals, right? Bad animals are fine. So the sages then proposed to kill Bar Kamsa. kill the messenger. If we kill him, he can't go back and tattle on us, right? He can't be a snitch. And then that'll solve the problem. But Rabbi Zechariah ben Avkulus, same guy, said, but is one who makes a blemish on consecrated animals to be put to death? People will say that if you blemish an animal, that you get executed. They'll draw the wrong conclusion. And so their hands get tied, right? They're too worried about giving the wrong message rather than actually solving the problem, which, as you notice from our discussion of them at the party, also at the party, they sat and didn't act. They sat and didn't protest and do something to fix that situation. And here too, Rabbi Yochanan remarks, because of the scrupulousness of Rabbi Zechariah ben Avkulus, our house has been destroyed, our temple burned, and we ourselves exiled from the land. Because he was being so careful not to do something wrong, he didn't do anything right. And that is what led to the destruction. But like I said, the initial spark was the fact that the sages wouldn't protest. They wouldn't stand up and try and solve this argument between two just regular people at a party. Good? Onward.
How would you solve it?
Depends on the circumstances. Right? Judaism always loves the details, which depends on what the nature of the fight is. It depends on the relationship between the two people. It depends on the relationship between the rabbi that's there and the host of the party and perhaps the other person as well. But there are always ways to try and defuse the situation. And even if they had failed, right, even if the host had continued to be completely rude, at least they would have tried. And by trying, they would have made sure that everyone else at the party, Bar Kamsa included, but everyone else who was watching, would know that what the host was doing was wrong. Right? Because sometimes that's the best you can possibly achieve. Right? You can't actually solve every problem, but you can at least let people know it's a problem. And if people know it's a problem, then it won't happen other places as much. So that was the opportunity they missed. So what happens when it's a problem and we shouldn't talk? Right? Sometimes there are things that we shouldn't engage with. And indeed, the book of Proverbs tells us this in a few different passages. To correct a scoffer or rebuke a wicked person for their blemish is to call down abuse on oneself. Basically, if the person's a jerk and you tell them they're a jerk, they're just going to be angry at you. You're not making anything better. Right? Do not rebuke the scoffer, for they will hate you. Reprove a wise person, and they will love you. Right? If you tell somebody who's a jerk that they're a jerk, if you tell someone who's an idiot that they're an idiot, they're just going to hate you. If you tell someone who's smart that what they're doing is stupid, they will thank you for it. Because that's what it is to be smart. That's what it is to be wise, is to recognize that someone who's helping you is helping you, even if they're pointing out a mistake. Because we shouldn't want to make mistakes. Right? That we should want to avoid mistakes in our life. Instruct a wise person and they will grow wiser. Teach a righteous person and they will gain in learning. So Proverbs lays down this idea that rebuke and criticism and instruction can sometimes go wasted or even begin to cause anger if it's for the wrong person. And so now we're back into the situation of this is complicated. Right? It sounded like after Bar Kamsa, it's protest everything, tell everyone when they're doing something wrong, we have to save the temple, don't just sit there. But there are times when you should keep your mouth shut. And now we need to figure out that balance, because obviously we have two different ideas from the Tanakh, from the Bible. One says, don't rebuke the wrong people, and one says, rebuke your fellow. How do I find how those go together? We're good on the problem, right? Big problem, always still to today. So, Sifra, one of the great collections of Midrashim from the earliest time, says, how do we know that if a person has rebuked his neighbor 4 or 5 times without success, that the person should continue to rebuke? Remember, Rambam says you just keep going till the person is like getting furious. Because it says, you shall surely rebuke the other. It's an intensive verb form that's used in the Hebrew. So one might then infer that reproof should be carried so far as to change a person's face with shame. The rabbis always use an idiom of making someone's face go white, as embarrassing a person. And if I read surely rebuke, I might think that means the gloves are off and I can keep rebuking no matter how bad I make the other person look, feel, or react. But it says, you shall not incur guilt upon the other, right? You shall not cause more guilt, which means you can only rebuke up to the point before you or the other person is now going to commit a new transgression. You're now making a new problem, right? Fixing the one problem by causing a new problem isn't fixing anything. It's just building more problems. So you have to find that strategy between. Rabbi Tarfon, one of the great rabbis of the earlier generation, said, in this generation, there is no one capable of rebuking. So his opinion was, no one should rebuke because no one knows how to do it right. Right? Every time anyone tries to criticize anyone, it always comes out wrong. So we're just stuck because everyone's terrible at this job. Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah said, in this generation, there is no one capable of receiving rebuke. It's not that you're doing it wrong, it's everyone hears it wrong. I'm sure you've all been in that situation, or at the very least have seen other people, where someone will make an innocent comment and the person will take it very personally as though they're being attacked. Right? Oh, have you considered doing that on that piece of work that you're doing? Oh, you think you can do this better than me? Like, no, I'm just trying to make a suggestion. I'm not, so I'm stupid. No. Who said you were right? Sometimes people will take a little bit of helpful criticism absolutely the wrong way. And so that's what he was saying. It's not that people can't give rebuke, it's no one can listen to rebuke. And Rabbi Akiva tries to say, in this generation, there was no one who knows how rebuke ought to be worded. It's not just that they're doing it wrong or they're hearing it wrong. It's even the phrasing can make a difference. Right? Just the way you say things can make a bigger difference sometimes even than are you rebuking or are you listening? It's that wording can make such a big difference. Okay, so first of all, we have to work on ourselves, right? So we need to be open to rebuke. Ben Zoma said, who is the one that is wise? One who learns from every person. As it is said, from all my teachers I have gained understanding, taken from Psalm 119. So what Ben Zoma is trying to say is that if you want to be considered wise, you have to be prepared to learn from everyone. And that doesn't mean sit in front of them like, teacher and student. That means that you sit in front of them when they point out your mistakes wherever it might be in life, right? The person who says, you pushed me with your trolley in the supermarket, that person is giving you a lesson and you should appreciate it rather than resent it, which is hard, right? I don't think I've ever met anybody who likes to be criticized. I don't think I've ever met anyone who likes to have their mistakes pointed out. But if we truly want to be wise, we have to find our mistakes, and often other people are better at seeing our mistakes than we are. Right? That's one reason why when I'm writing something like an article, I'll give it to someone else to proofread, because I'm not going to find my typos. I'm not going to find my misspellings, and I'm not going to find, my poor choices of words, because I thought it was good. That's why I wrote it that way. But I recognize that it doesn't always work. Sometimes there are typos, sometimes there are, just misspellings, and sometimes the way I tried to say something doesn't sound correct for what I wanted it to say to other people. And I need other people to tell me, have you thought about rewording this? Or this passage doesn't really seem clear. And I have to say, thank you, right? Because if I didn't have them pointing out my mistakes, I would not be able to do better than I was doing on my own. But that's hard because that takes an openness to other people that many of us have difficulty with. Because most of us feel that any criticism, it makes us feel like we have somehow been put down, that we have been insulted, that we are less and not as capable as the person who's making the observation. But the fact is, like I said, you can't see the bit of dirt that's on the back of your shirt because that's just not where your eyes go. That doesn't mean the other person has no dirt on the back of their shirt. It just means they can see yours and you can see theirs. And if you help each other, no one has to have dirt. Good? So, as Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi continues to say, a person should love rebuke, since as long as there is rebuke in the world, ease of mind comes to the world, good and blessing come to the world, and evil departs from it. Criticism makes the world a better place. I know. Nowadays, in our modern social media climate and political climate, criticism is just one more weapon that seems to be used against each other for hate. But it is supposed to be a tool of good. It is supposed to be something that brings ease of mind. If someone tells I did something wrong, I can fix it. I feel better now that I fixed the problem. If I didn't fix it, then the problem would continue to grow and cause more trouble. So it brings peace to the world. As it says in Proverbs, those who rebuke find favor, and a good blessing falls upon them. All right. But it needs to come with love. And I mean only with love, not with anger, not with resentment, not with hate. As Rabbi Yossi ben Hanina said, a love without reproof, without rebuke, is no love. I mean, you probably heard that old phrase, if you love something, set it free, right? According to him, if you love something, point out its mistakes. Yeah, that's love, right? Love is the person who tells you, you got something between your teeth, right? Because they're saving you from the embarrassment. Love is the person who says, you really probably shouldn't have that third margarita, right? Love is the person who takes your keys away from you before you drive home drunk, right? That's love. And that means that love needs criticism. With love, meaning not an angry criticism, not a hateful criticism, not a humiliating criticism, but a loving criticism, a loving pointing out of some problem or mistake. And as Reish Lakish said, another one of the great rabbis, reproof leads to peace. A peace where there has been no reproof is no peace. I'm sure you have all been in either situations, either yourself or family or friends, where two people were angry with each other, and then they stopped talking, and the room just got quiet. Great, they stopped talking, so now there's peace. No, now there's tension, because no one is willing to say what's really bothering them. No one's willing to talk about the real problems. They're just angry and quiet. That's not peace. All right, that's just preparing for the next battle. If you want to have true peace, you have to explain what the problems are. Again, from a loving place, not from an angry, hateful place. Sometimes that does mean a little wait before you try and engage in the conversation again, because you can't speak without feeling anger, but that is our foundation. So now that we know what I need to feel to hear rebuke, what I should be feeling when I'm giving rebuke, there are still times when I should or shouldn't. It's still, as you can tell, a very complicated topic. So from Likutei Moharan, this is from Rabbi Nachman of Bratslav, one of the great Hasidic rabbis of the 1800s. Rebuke is a great thing, and it is incumbent. It's our duty for each Jew to rebuke his friend when he sees him acting in a way that is not allowed. As it says, you shall surely rebuke your neighbor, back in Leviticus again. Even so, not everyone is able to rebuke. As Rabbi Akiva said, I would be surprised if there was a person in our generation who is able to rebuke. That was who don't know how to do the wording of rebuke. And if Rabbi Akiva said this about his generation, all the more so today. Sort of a general feeling that they were wonderful, we are less than wonderful, and that's sort of been progressing. Because when one rebukes who is not able to rebuke, then one will not be able to receive the rebuke, and it causes a putrid smell in the souls that hear it. So this is very poetic language, but basically what he's saying is if you get your criticism wrong, the person who's hearing it will hear it wrong, and that is going to poison the relationship. That is going to ruin whatever is going on. It is going to make things more rotten than it was just by the person doing something wrong. Following the logic? Yeah.
Have you heard this saying, I don't know if it's only in Spanish, you're not a prophet in your own land?
Yes.
I don't know if I'm translating well, but like with family members, it's very hard to tell them with all the love that you have.
Right.
To tell them something because they will take it wrong.
Right. And sometimes when you're close enough to a person, sometimes you can find a way to give them insight, to give them help without doing it too directly. Right. So, if it's, I'm trying to think of a case, where it might be in a family situation where it's not an emergency, but you do want to help. Let's say your brother, your sister, and their spouse are having a lot of arguments, right? They're not listening to each other. So rather than saying, you really need to listen to each other and you need to work this out because right now your marriage is heading the wrong direction, which is probably not going to be heard really well by your brother or sister when you point out that you think their marriage is tanking. You need to instead talk about perhaps what you just had as a problem with one of your friends. I had such a big blow up with my friend last week, but we finally sat down and worked it out, right? You're not telling them, go work it out. You're telling them, I have worked something out with a friend and I'm relieved about it. I made a problem similar to you and I found a solution that could work for you too. But it's not coming across as a slap in the face. Sometimes you do have to be direct, right? If it's your brother or sister or even your father or mother that's about to get in the car and they're drunk, taking their keys, even if it's going to make them angry, is saving their life and saving the life of a potential victim. So if someone has a chemical dependency, they're on drugs, they're an alcoholic, they're doing something else that is leading to their poor health and will eventually kill them, maybe sooner than later, then you also have an obligation to speak more directly. But you're right, sometimes you have to be next to a criticism rather than so direct because of the relationship. All right. I'm going to give another example. I know there's a lot of depressing ones this week. I'm sorry. Another example of how not to have an argument and how not to fix an argument. So this is one of my absolute favorite sad stories from the Talmud because it's about two rabbis that became best friends and then ended up basically killing each other. But not with, with a knife, but in a different way. So it starts off with Rabbi Yochanan. Rabbi Yochanan was considered the most beautiful man in his entire generation, just gorgeous. And he's bathing in the Jordan, right? He's in the Jordan River and he's taking a bath. And Reish Lakish, at this time, is not a rabbi. Reish Lakish is a bandit, right? He has a group of armed men. Think Robin Hood, but without the good part, right? He just goes around stealing, raping, attacking. That was who he was. So Reish Lakish sees him, and he leaps into the Jordan after him. Now, why was he jumping into the river? He thought he was a woman because he was so beautiful. He was seeing him from behind, and he jumped into the river because he was going to rape her. That was who Reish Lakish was. He was that kind of person. So Rabbi Yochanan turns around, and they're both a little surprised, and he says to him, "Your strength should be for the Torah." Right? That's rebuke. That is a criticism. You are living a life where you're using all of this power, this passion, this energy you have, and you're using it for stealing and raping. If you turn that energy towards living a life of Torah, towards study, that would be amazing. And Reish Lakish's response is, well, your beauty should be for women, right? You think I'm strong. Well, you're too pretty to be a guy, right? So again, he's responding very negatively. But notice how Rabbi Yochanan parries, he deflects that. If you repent, if you do tshuva, if you change, if you stop being a bandit, if you stop doing all of this, then I will let you marry my sister, who is more beautiful than I. How's that for a deal? Now, his sister, of course, still has to agree to it, don't worry. But the idea is, I am willing to accept you into my family, right, if my sister will have you. And you can have a beautiful woman and be a moral person. Right? It's not like you have to choose between having beautiful women and being a bandit and not having beautiful women but living a good life. You can have a beautiful wife and be a good person. And Reish Lakish agrees. He repents. And when he wished to return and collect his weapons, he goes back up on the river. He cannot, right? Now, as he gets out of the river, he really has had a change of heart in that river. And he stares at his weapons and he can't pick them up anymore. Right? He has really genuinely converted to a proper good life. It was one of those flash moments, the moment of epiphany, moment of clarity. He realizes that his life has been a waste, and now he is going to make something good from his life. So Rabbi Yochanan taught him. He taught him the Bible, the Tanakh, he taught him Mishnah, and he made him into a great man. They become study partners. They become as close as brothers, or maybe even closer. And Reish Lakish does indeed marry Rabbi Yochanan's sister, right? Happy ever after. What a wonderful story. Okay, many years go by, where it is a happy story. And now we get to the end. Now, one day, there was a dispute in the Beit HaMidrash. Beit HaMidrash is the house of study. And they're arguing about a different point of Jewish law. A sword, a knife, a dagger, a spear, a handsaw, a scythe. Right? These are all bladed implements, things that have a blade. At what stage can they become unclean? You don't need to worry too much about the details, but in Jewish law, there are issues of ritual purity, and something that is made by a person becomes susceptible. It is able to become ritually impure only once it is in the final stage of its construction. Right? A rock can't become ritually impure, but if you turn the rock into a hammer, by melting it down and making iron out of it and turning it into a hammer, the hammer could become ritually impure. And they're arguing about where in the construction process does that happen. Don't worry about that detail. If you want to study Talmud, we can talk about it. But for the story, you don't need to know. So they're arguing, and when the crafting is finished, of course, but when is the crafting finished? Rabbi Yochanan ruled when they are tempered in a furnace. He says when you put it in the heat and you get it up to that nice heat to make the blade last, to make it a proper blade, that is close enough to the end that it's finished. Reish Lakish says when they have been quenched in water. No. He says you have to take it out of the furnace and you have to plunge it into the water, sound effects included, in order for it to truly be finished, which he actually is kind of right. The edge will not last if you just let it cool slowly. You do have to quench it in the water. Okay, so we got the argument here? Good. Rabbi Yochanan says to him, a bandit understands his trade. Whoa. Whoa. Right? Remember, this is years later that they have been living with, as brothers-in-law, and studying together and working together. They have done so much. And now they're in the middle of a fight over this piece of Jewish law. And all of a sudden, Rabbi Yochanan draws out, you're a bandit, right? Like I haven't been a bandit for decades. Like, what are you talking about? Reish Lakish says to him, and how have you helped me then? Right? Before I was called a master of thieves, and now I am called a master of Torah, right? A rabbi. And Rabbi Yochanan responds back by bringing you under the wings of the Shekhinah, of God's presence. Right? So notice, it's gone wrong. Each one of them, right? Rabbi Yochanan first made the mistake of insulting him, but by Rabbi Reish Lakish's response, he makes it harder for Rabbi Yochanan to apologize, and by Rabbi Yochanan's response, it makes it harder for Reish Lakish to also back off. So they each keep escalating the fight until the point where they separate. And Rabbi Yochanan, remember the guy who made the first insult, he now feels deeply hurt. And Reish Lakish, because of all of this, he becomes sick. So his sister, the wife of Reish Lakish, comes to Rabbi Yochanan and says, forgive him for the sake of my son. And he replies, this is Rabbi Yochanan, leave your fatherless children, I will preserve them alive, which is a quote from the prophets. Basically, let him die, and your kid will be an orphan, but God takes care of orphans, so that's okay. Yeah, this is harsh. This is harsh. And she says, for the sake of my widowhood, don't make me a widow, right? Come to my husband, apologize, let there be reconciliation so he doesn't die and I become a widow. And he continues the quote from the Tanakh, and let your widows trust in me, meaning trust in God. And Reish Lakish dies. Right? He dies of basically a broken heart that he and Rabbi Yochanan have not been able to reconcile. And Rabbi Yochanan then, he goes into grief. Right? Story's not done. Remember, I said there were going to be two bodies at the end. So the other rabbis say, who will go and ease his mind? Who's going to go help Rabbi Yochanan, who is now going crazy out of grief? Let Rabbi Elazar ben Padat go, right? Because his disquisitions, I love the English word, right? His ability to ask questions is very subtle. He has a really good mind. He'll be a good replacement for Reish Lakish. They'll be good study buddies. So he went and he sat before him, and at every point that Rabbi Yochanan said, he said, there is a Braita which supports you. A Braita is another piece of Jewish tradition. So basically, every time Rabbi Yochanan says something, Rabbi Elazar ben Padat says, "You're right, and I have more proof to help you."
Yes.
A yes man, you might say, right? He's a yes man. And so Rabbi Yochanan says, "Are you the son of Lakisha, right? Are you the replacement for Reish Lakish? When I state a law, the son of Lakisha used to raise 24 objections, to which I gave 24 answers. And that meant that we had a better understanding of the law. While you say, a Braita has been taught that supports you. Do I not know that I am already right?" And he is saying the point of study is not to have someone tell you you're right. The point of study is to have a person challenge you, to point out your mistakes so that you can make your argument stronger and better, or change your argument if your argument was wrong. Just telling me I'm right means nothing gets better. So now, notice he is finally understanding, Rabbi Yochanan, that when he and Reish Lakish were arguing about the sword and the spears and all of that he wanted the person to argue back against him. He wanted there to be a good discussion. He wanted the criticism of his views so that they could understand Torah better. Now he gets it, but it's too late because Reish Lakish is dead. So, thus he went on, rending his garments and weeping, "Where are you, son of Lakisha? Where are you, son of Lakisha?" And he cried until his mind was turned. Thereupon the rabbis prayed for him, and he died. So they both ended up dead, because they each made their own mistakes of how they tried to criticize each other and how they refused to allow there to be peace made between them. And these were great rabbis. These were not like bad people. Well, Reish Lakish started as a bad person, but he got a lot better. Right? It's so easy to get caught up when someone criticizes you or takes a different position than you, of fighting back and wanting to beat them. But when you're having an argument with someone that you care about and that you love, you're not fighting against them. You're on the same team. Right? You're just trying to find the best answer. You're not trying to win the argument. You're trying to learn from the argument. And that means you have to listen to other people. Okay. So, Mesilat Yesharim from the Musar movement, which is a great movement in the early modern period, trying to help people cultivate their morals and their character to be better and better, so that you weren't only focused on, am I doing the law right, but am I being the best person I can? And Mesilat Yesharim is considered to be sort of the number one book on it. So very often, a man will undertake to rebuke sinners in such a place or at such a time that he will cause them to go even further in their wickedness, and to add to their sins by desecrating the name of God. You self-righteous son of a, how dare you tell me I'm doing something wrong? If that's what you think your God wants, then I curse your God, right? This is what's known in psychology as the backfire effect. That sometimes when you give people evidence against their views, it makes them stronger in their attitude against you. No matter how much proof you give to some people, if it's given in the wrong way, they simply dig in deeper in order to resist you, to fight back. And this is what he's warning about, right? In such cases, silence alone constitutes saintliness. Right? You don't become a saint by walking down the street saying, "Sinner, sinner, sinner," to everybody you see. Right? That's not what God wants. As our sages of blessed memory said, just as it is a mitzvah, that's a real typo, just as it is a mitzvah to say what will be listened to, so it is a mitzvah not to say what will not be listened to. So, hopefully you're getting the idea here that it's hard. Right? It's complicated. You have to speak up, just like Moses did, and you also have to keep your mouth shut, just like other people should have. And wisdom is knowing when to do each. The one thing we do have in our control, however, is how we respond when other people have pointed out our mistakes. That's something that we can control, and that hopefully we can make ourselves used to hearing criticism without feeling anger, without feeling like I have to defend myself. Sometimes other people's criticism is wrong, and it is okay to point out if you think that criticism is wrong, but to do it from a corrective way rather than from a defensive way. 1 Samuel 20, you can go home and read if you want to see how bad it can go. The story of Saul and his son Jonathan. whom he is trying to protect from David, who is about to become the new king. And in the process of trying to protect Jonathan, he throws a spear at him because he's angry at his son. Not the right solution, right? I want to save you, so I'm going to throw a spear at you. Okay, but read that on your own, because I want to get to one more story of a little bit more recently. We're back with Rambam, with Maimonides. And this time, after Rambam wrote his philosophy book, The Guide for the Perplexed, Moreh Nevuchim, there were many people who heard about it who thought that it sounded like it was heresy, like he was somehow saying that Judaism didn't believe in God or didn't believe in creation, because it was all like Aristotle, and Aristotle doesn't believe in creation. So people began to think that he'd gone off the deep end. So the rabbis of Germany, which was across the Mediterranean, Rambam lived in Egypt at this time, the rabbis of Germany decided to send someone to meet him to see if it was true, right? So good, they're investigating before they jump to conclusions. That's nice. So Rabbi Meir was confused at what he saw. Rabbi Meir shows up and he watches Rambam presenting things. So first, food which looked like a human hand was put on the table, right? This is dinner. Secondly, a servant named Peter fetched the wine for the guest. And finally, a calf slaughtered for him by clubbing, right? They literally took out a baby cow, clubbed it to death, and served it. Now, obviously, eating human flesh, we all know that's wrong. Obviously, we know that when you do kashrut, an animal has to be slaughtered in shpita, which is a knife stroke to the neck, very surgical precision. Clubbing is not allowed. And the question about Peter was that in the ancient world, there was a very real concern that people who were not Jewish would often take wine, even if they were just holding it for a moment, and say blessings over it to their idols. And so there was suspicion that these people who were not Jewish would be doing it. And Peter is about the most not Jewish name you could find in Europe at the time. So all three of these things looked like a huge problem to Rabbi Meir. So Rabbi Meir gave some excuses, and he didn't eat anything. Right? This is his compromise. Now, Rambam asked him what he thought. And Rabbi Meir kept his mouth shut. I've got to give him credit. But the problem is, even though he's keeping his mouth shut, he's still judging. And he still thinks that Rambam is breaking all of these laws. So Rambam explained, first, the human hand was a kind of vegetable that looks like a hand. Right? There's apparently some kind of vegetable that grows in that part of the Middle East that it kind of looks like a, melony-looking squash with bits of fingers sticking out of it. Secondly, Peter was Jewish, right? And hasn't Rabbi Meir ever heard of the Talmudic sage, Rabbi Yosef ben Patrus, right? There are other rabbis that were named even in the Talmud with a name like Peter, or at least the way Peter was said in their country. So you shouldn't jump to the conclusion that this person is not Jewish just because their name is Peter. And thirdly, the calf was removed from the womb of a pregnant cow that was slaughtered according to halacha. Now, we're not going to go into all the details here, but if the mother is killed while pregnant, then the child was considered to have been killed when the mother was killed, even if the child is alive. Right? For animals, this doesn't count for people. Right? Although we can have a longer discussion about how this does have implications on abortion. But the slaughtering of the mother is considered to make the rest of her body kosher, even if part of her body contains a baby cow. And then if that baby cow grows up and you know for sure it was that baby cow is considered to already have been slaughtered. And so technically you could kill it by clubbing it, which you normally wouldn't do, but Rambam was trying to make a point. So, having learned this great lesson, Rabbi Meir returned to Germany and reported that Rambam is no heretic. Rabbi Meir said, to judge another without all the facts makes one worthy of flogging, right? If you judge another person without having got all the information, you should be whipped, not the other person that you suspect. Clear? Clear. All right. We should, when we do judge, and we do have to make opinions about other people and other actions, we should at least always look for what we call kaf zahut, on the side of merit. We should try to interpret things as favorably as possible, right? That we shouldn't jump to the most negative of conclusions. We should always lean towards something that is positive or understanding or forgiving of what has just happened. It may turn out to be wrong, right? But we should start from that position and then slowly come to the realization as we get more facts that what happened was actually worse than we thought. That is much easier and much better emotionally than starting off by imagining everything to be horrible and then slowly maybe beginning to realize it wasn't as bad as I thought. Right? That is a much harder emotional hill to climb. It's not as much fun to realize that the positive thing is turning negative, but it is easier to go that way than the other direction. Right? Because once you're angry at a person, we tend to stop looking for facts that help excuse them. Good? All right. So one last thing to try and put this into a little bit more of a spiritually reflective position. This is from Seder Hadorot HaChadash, which is a collection of teachings, in this case, of the Baal Shem Tov, who was the very first Hasidic rabbi. So a great teaching to the Baal Shem Tov, planted for us, is that if you see another person doing something ugly, meditate on the presence of that same ugliness in ourselves. Right? If you see somebody run a red light, if you see someone being rude to another person, if you see someone about to steal a car, whatever it might be, think about whether there is a spark of that same feeling, not necessarily the same deed, but the same instinct, the same impulse within yourself. And know that it is one of God's mercies that God brought this sight before your eyes in order to remind you of that fault in you, so as to bring you back to repentance. For if you saw someone desecrating Shabbat or desecrating God's name or some other way, you should examine your own deeds, and you will certainly find among them desecration of the Shabbat and cursing God's name. It doesn't have to be as obvious or blatant as what you saw the other person doing, but chances are you were making that same mistake. And God allowed you to be in that place at that time to see that deed so that you would recognize that mistake in yourself. Right? This is God's gentle form of rebuke. Right? Rather than throwing lightning bolts at us, which never really works, instead God puts situations in front of us where, yes, we have to deal with the consequences of other people doing bad stuff, but we also have to say, but maybe I do some of that too. Maybe I'm not exactly innocent. Doesn't mean that we can't still criticize them. Doesn't mean that we can't still stop whatever damage they're causing. Right? The one without sin cast the first stone, that we don't do that, right? I throw the stone to stop the person who's about to murder someone, even though I'm also guilty of bad stuff, because I have to stop it. But I do also have to wonder, how violent do I get? Right? How angry do I get? Have I ever made a person feel in danger? Right? What has my behavior been like that I happen to be in this position to see this? So if you heard some profanity or obscene language, you should consider your own impudence, right? Your own arrogance and misuse. And when you failed to conduct yourself modestly. If you heard some skeptical or atheistic talk from someone, then you should work to strengthen your faith and trust in God. So this is our own way of self-rebuking, of noticing our mistakes in a way that we might otherwise be oblivious to. Because the hardest thing there is to notice our own mistakes. That's why we should appreciate criticism from others. But even if others are not brave enough or skilled enough to give us good criticism, we should recognize that there are chances around us all the time to notice our own mistakes if we're willing to actually confront them, which is, of course, what we should. Because if we don't, well, that's how you end up with hatred. That's how you end up with anger. It's how you end up with destruction. It's how you end up with Tisha B'Av that we'll be commemorating this weekend. Any questions on this very complicated and depressing topic?
I was studying Rabbi Shalom Arush.
Mm-hmm.
He has a book, The Garden of Emunah.
Uh-huh.
He's a wrestler.
Guarding faith for the translation for Emunah is your faith. Yeah.
And he was saying that we should take like 1 hour minimum a day to do an introspection, like auto-correction, auto-judging,
right?
To help out with all these behaviors that are human.
So, setting a goal of 1 hour a day is an interesting way of doing it. Really, each time we do tefillah, each time we do prayer, there should be an introspective element to it. The term that's often used is a cheshbon nefesh, which is a spiritual accounting. And that's one of the reasons why, if you remember from the earlier videos, I think many of you weren't here when we did Rosh Hashanah originally, one of the reasons why Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur happen at this time of year is because we are doing a physical accounting, right? We were counting all of our wheat, we were counting all of our fruit, and we were seeing what we had from our last harvest. And so we should also do a spiritual accounting, right? How much good have I done? How much bad have I done? And if I did bad stuff, those are like debts. I need to fix them, right? I need to go to the person I insulted. I need to return something that I borrowed and failed to bring back when I should have. I need to, make sure that I am changing how I treat my spouse, my children, my parents, my siblings, whatever other things that need fixing. I do my accounting. Now we do that most intensely on Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, but we should be doing a day-to-day checkup. Right? It's the same way that I hope you don't only check your bank accounts right before tax season, right? You maybe check, balance your checkbook every so often. If people still use checkbooks, you at least open up your credit card bills and check them and make sure that you are on a firm financial footing. We should be doing regular spiritual checkups as well and making sure that we're on a firm footing for that too. But as depressing as it can be to open a credit card bill that's overdue, we all know that it's better to open it up, take care of it, and do the best we can now rather than letting it only build up. The same is true spiritually, right? As depressing or difficult as it can be to confront our mistakes, our errors, and problems, it's better to take care of it soon rather than letting it pile up and then becoming a huge weight in our life. That's why on Yom Kippur, if you've done this whole spiritual house cleaning and done it as thoroughly as possible on Yom Kippur actually becomes a remarkably beautiful, liberating, freeing, joyous day. Because you finish the day just feeling amazing because you have taken care of all the things that need to be taken care of. It's the equivalent of opening up your bank account, seeing a nice full account, and knowing that you have no credit card bills, no car payments, nothing that's due. You're free and clear. Tomorrow you will, but at least for that one moment, and for that one moment, everything is good. And that only happens if we're willing to do that self-examination, that introspection. So good reminder of the season. Any other questions or comments? Okay, take care.